So this is the final lecture for the psychological foundations of musical behavior. I'm sure you are as excited to know that this is the last one as I am as excited that this is the last one to record. And today we're going to be talking about creative generative processes, specifically looking at composition and improvisation. And it's probably not going to be a terribly long lecture because I'm mostly just bringing out the really important points that were brought out in the reading. Um, I'll add a little bit about some of the research that's looked into improvisation, but but yeah, I think the authors do a pretty nice job about kind of talking about how this idea that there were specific types of musicians, improvisers versus composers versus performers. That's really a pretty modern idea. That when you look at Baroque music, that everyone was really good at improvising. There were elements of their performance that was always improvised, and also that it was really until the late 19th century that if you were a famous musician, what you did was you composed your own music. They went hand in hand as far as composing and performing together. So this is really kind of a new idea, and it begs the question of, well, why aren't we doing this more? And it's probably, from our cultural standpoint, it comes from the uh, the paradigm of how our music education is structured, in that most people experience just learning to play other people's music. They aren't ever given the license to compose their own music. So, um, the authors, they say to think about these creative processes as being part of our daily activities, and they are things that we do we still do today. We just don't do them in quite as large fashion. We don't, improvise um, a 20-minute cadenza in the middle of a solo piece like you would in some other media. Anyway, so why do we? And one thing to mention is that this module is not as steeped in the psychological literature as most of the other ones. I did look at a couple of articles that I thought about making you read, but they get very complicated as far as talking about the different parts of the brain that are activated when improvising. That's kind of, it's hard to do that with actual composing because you have to be in a scanner to do it. There is research that is emerging on that, but one of the reasons why it's hard to really study this is because just the nature of being creative is a bit elusive. The book does a good job of kind of talking about why it's hard to study it, especially when you think about for studying composing. One of the main techniques that they do is they have composers to think aloud while they're composing something, so they can get an idea about why they make the choices that they make. Improvisers can't really do that. They can go back and retroactively say, well, I think I was thinking this at this time, or I decided to do this because this presented itself. So it's very retrospective, and so there's some good things about that, but there's also, you have to wonder about the validity of the claims being made too. So that's one of the difficulties about researching these types of processes. And I also think another reason why we're just now kind of understanding these generative processes is because we don't, I think as a culture, sorry, my email just keeps going off. We don't what was I saying? Oh, we don't value composing improvisation as much as we value performing, and that's just how our musical culture is structured. Within certain communities, those things might be valued. For instance, in jazz communities, improvisation, of course, is more highly valued. But when you think about when students are learning their instruments, in lessons or in the classroom, they aren't given a whole lot of opportunities to improvise and to compose. And so those are kind of some of the hardships in really understanding these things from a psychological perspective. So what did the book say about looking at the process of composing? And some of the earlier research, I forget the name of the guy who proposed this theory, but had this idea that there are certain composers that are worker types, and there are certain composers that are inspirational types. The worker types are problem solvers. They really do a lot of trial and error to try to figure out what works, what doesn't work. While inspirational types, they get inspirational types just get that that inspiration, and they can solve the problem. It just comes out of nowhere. And in the text, it gives a couple of different examples of who fits into which category. As with most things, when you kind of say that there are two categories, that's probably not the best way to, that's not a very good theoretical framework, because while there's probably some truth to that idea, it's probably more of a continuum, right? That there are people that are more the worker type, but they do have moments of inspiration, while there are some that are inspirational types, but they still do problem solving. So I think one way to look at it is just to think a little more continuum. Then it was mentioned the Colley, Banton, Down, and Pither study that looked at, I think it was 3 student composers and 1 expert, or I think that's what it was. And they had them do think aloud, a think aloud study where they gave them the challenge of composing an accompaniment to a soprano line, and they found that those that did the students, or the student composers, novice composers, they went more chord by chord and just solve the problems as they encountered them, while the expert was really able to kind of take a step back and look at the whole problem, look at how to what kind of cadence was it gonna need? Well, what is the melody line doing versus the other parts? And it was more of a holistic approach, which is probably more indicative of just how perspectives change as people mature within a certain discipline. Further researchers have kind of created this composition process, or this generative process, where they call it preparation, elaboration, illumination. Oops, that's not right. It's preparation, incubation, illumination, elaboration, and verification. I apologize. In my notes, I wrote 2 things backwards. So. And so in the preparation phase, they're really just gathering their skills. They're just seeing, they're developing their own aesthetic, the way that they view what should work and what shouldn't work, and just building skills. In the incubation part, that's where they are given an aesthetic problem that they need to solve. They need to, whether it's that they have decided that they're going to compose a certain type of piece, or they're given the parameters of what they're composing. Illumination is the phase where they get an onslaught of ideas to attack that problem that they encounter in the incubation period. So illumination is kind of the catalyst for the actual composition, the ideas that are just, that come into play while in order to attack the aesthetic problem. During the elaboration period, this is kind of the trial and error period where they figure out what works, what doesn't work, and then they have to revise and edit accordingly by what works and what doesn't work to really solve that aesthetic problem. And then finally, there's the verification process where they get feedback from other people on the quality of their solution to the aesthetic problem, which says, which in the book it really talks about how composers don't necessarily like the verification process because it's completely out of their control, and it's kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down situation, whether people like it or they don't. So that's, I think it's a pretty interesting way to articulate how this process develops, or, how it unfolds over time. So kind of switching gears a little bit towards improvisation, as I mentioned before, the challenge with improvisation is that there's no good way to really understand why decisions are made when they are made other than asking people reflectively. Similarly to composition, there was a study that looked at novices and experts, and they really found that the novices really didn't understand why they were making the choices that were making. They just did them. And then experts, were able to say why they used certain strategies, or what they were attempting to do, or what was the motivation for the choices that they made. When thinking about the generative process that I just outlined a minute ago, the preparation, incubation, illumination, elaboration, and verification process, improvisers really have a different experience than composers when dealing with this process. For improvisers, they don't really have the elaboration process that composers do, because composers do their trial and error privately, that they can kind of work out, what works and what doesn't work. Whereas improvisers, they are normally working out the solutions, while they're improvising in the midst of a performance. They could be doing it some while they are practicing in the practice room, but it's really in public where everyone can see the mistakes. And so the elaboration and verification process are really different. Whereas jazz, or improvisers in general, not just jazz improvisers, but improvisers in general, they get the instantaneous feedback on the choices they make in their trial and errors. And so they get a lot of feedback, verification feedback. And even though their elaboration, they maybe don't have quite as long a period to elaborate on what choices to make. They get a lot of feedback very quickly, both from the audience as well as from their, the people that they're playing with. Whereas composers, they have plenty of time to, work out the elaboration on their own. But then when they put it out there, it's a very concrete product, and then the audience really just, weighs in on their thoughts. The book also does a nice job of talking about how when improvisers improvise, they're not just making everything up out of thin air. And this is where I was trying to find another reading to accompany this chapter for you guys, and I couldn't find the study I read a couple of years ago. And it was one of these studies where they took a group of improvisers and they had them play together, and then they just reflected about the choices that they made as a group afterwards. I couldn't find. I think it's a JRME article. I just couldn't find it. But one of the things that was really interesting was them talking about this, about how things are not, they are not just, improvising. They're not making up out of thin air all these things. There's this idea that they kind of have these different licks, and different players have or riffs that they can just kind of put into the right within a certain context, and then it can help solve the musical problem at hand. And one of the things about this article that I liked, it really talked about the importance of the interaction between the people, the other people playing, in that you kind of have your own personal vocabulary of things that you do as an improviser. And then as you interact with someone else, what vocabulary is going to work well with the vocabulary that you're hearing them play. And so you kind of do this back and forth thing. That was, I think, one of the things that was really interesting about the article, is that it really kind of brings improvisation. It uses a lot of language type of, or thinking about improvisation as a similar process to speech, where you're not necessarily thinking of every word as you say it, but you're thinking in chunks, and like that's kind of all coming out at the same time, and then you fit other chunks together once you realize that you need to come up with that next material. So it's really interesting. And like I said, there's been some, more technical types of studies that have looked at, improvising within, or like what the brain is doing as improvisation is happening. Like I said, we're kind of at the early stages of that. And the defining what improvisation is, because a lot of times, you can have very little movement within a scanner, and so, some of these studies, they just have, a little keyboard, and you can only play 5 different notes. So, the question then is, well, is that really improvisation or not? It's the task that they're asking them to do in the scanner seems so far removed from what a player would do in a genuine setting that it doesn't necessarily seem like it would be very useful. So the chapter kind of ends with talking about, well, how does one learn to be creative, which I think this is really important for us as music educators. One of the things they mention is that there needs to be an abundance of requisite knowledge and skill. They just have to be good at playing music. They have to have an ability to understand their instrument and how it works in order for it to write or improvise on it correctly. So one is just putting in hours on the instrument or the musical medium in which they're trying to gain expertise. There are ways that they can go about doing this. One is, through copying. And I like how the text really shows that there's kind of these 2 different routes. There's the one of like the old school, like really old school way of, oh, you want to be a composer, so you're going to actually copy manuscripts of the great composers so that you understand what they did. While other versions, or the other path is saying, oh, well, you can just copy it through listen orally and copy it like the Beatles did, or as Lucy Green suggests to do in her book on how popular musicians learn, that this copying really helps the student get to the technical aspects of putting things together. Another step in learning to be creative is to get feedback from an expert or from a teacher, which that seems really straightforward, that if people are wanting to become composers or great improvisers, then they need people to help guide them. And lastly, which again, this is kind of a no-brainer, is that in order to become a strong composer or improviser, that they need to do a lot of listening, especially in the media that they are interested in working in, which, that's one of the things that they say a challenge is that, if there's a new style of music that is emerging out of somewhere, then you can't just go and listen to it. You have to kind of go to where it's actually happening. Although nowadays that's not necessarily true. I mean, the book was written in 2011, I think, and sorry, a lot of emails are coming across my desktop this morning. So I was talking about jazz. I was talking about listening. But nowadays, like, even if there is some, if there's some new musical genre that's coming out of, even if it's a pretty remote part of the United States, you can probably find a lot of stuff online about it right now. It's a good time to be able to access, the things that are new and interesting in the world of music. Although perhaps I say that, and I'm completely just thinking on the spot. Perhaps there's just so much information now that it's hard to find out what is truly new. I'm a choral person, and it's really hard for me to stay up on like what is the new interesting thing that isn't gimmicky, right? Like what is something that has a profound effect? What is going to pass the test of time versus this is the new thing that does something really weird that we all should pay attention to. So I guess there's that debate too. Anyway, so the book also talks about this constant probability of success theory, and I just wanted to talk about it just for a second because I don't know that it was entirely clear in the text. So what it's suggesting is that everyone has a bell curve of the quality of their work. So let's say you're a composer and you're a grade A composer. Most of the things that you write are really well received. However, there are going to be some things that you write are not going to be as well received, and then some things that are going to be more. So I guess maybe we should say you're more like a B composer. So like most of the things are kind of cropping up at the B+, A- range, but you've got some things that are in the A+ range and some things that are in the C range. So the idea is that over time, so I was making a bell curve. And that's not the diagram that they have in the book. So over time, the more output you have, the greater the likelihood that one of those pieces you write is going to be like profoundly change the world of music, or it's going to make a huge impact on the musical world. And that's where they talk about the 10-year law, that most of the really great works of composers were about 10 years after they started doing what they're doing. And so there's this idea that like the diagram, and this is where I'm going to do this backwards, but it might be backwards on I'll do it this way. So like, when you start composing, for the first 10 years, you have this huge shot up, and then it kind of plateaus, and then it starts going down. So that's, the probability that you will have a piece that is very impactful. And it really shoots up early in the career, and then as you maybe, I don't know which way will look right for you, but as it goes down, like as you get older, the probability kind of decreases, and that's pretty much for two reasons. One, it decreases because your output is going to, as you get older and older, your output decreases. Kind of, it makes sense that in people's 20s and 30s, that's when they really have a lot of creative output, because there are not as many things on the person's plate. they may not be married, they may not have a family, you know, they may get sick over time, they may just have more responsibilities, and then as they get older and older, then the probability decreases. So yeah, so that's, I think there's some truth to that, but again, it's this kind of theoretical thing. I mean, you know, there are plenty of exceptions to rules, right? So it's just a way to explain what is, you know, what we've noticed as far as those that have really impacted the world of music with their compositions. So that kind of wraps up that lecture. That was kind of short and sweet. A couple of things. Next, so this is the last lecture. Next week is your final. And it's very similar to the other midterms, or the third midterm. It is cumulative, and you should think, I think about 2/3 of it is based on the new material, and then 1/3 of it is previous stuff. I'll take a look at it, and if that's not the case, I will let you know in an email. So you do need to look over your other things. You do need to know. Oh, you do need to also submit the other data collection that's due next week as well. I'm sure you're getting email announcements that you need to fill out the online evaluation. Please do that. I know that it's a hassle to take time to, but it does give me feedback on how to make things better. There are two kind of questions that I'm going to post to you guys that you might put in the free response of it, or you can email me this directly if you don't mind it being having your name attached to it. But one is, you know, for those of you that took this online class and those that took it last semester, I kind of approached them very differently. This one was much more structured. You had a week by week. You had reading quizzes, versus last semester where you had about 2 to 3 weeks at a time to work on a module. There were a lot less modules, but you had more time to do it. From my perspective, it seemed like this worked better in that you had to do a little bit of work more consistently, as opposed to, you know, having a weekend where you were working all weekend on reading all the stuff and writing. So if you could give me feedback on if you think one is better than the other, or if they both are fine, or, you know, just let me know on your feelings about that. The second thing is about the multiple chances to take quizzes and the tests. Most of you are doing very well in this class, and I'm fine with that. Like, you know, if you're learning the material, then you should deserve a high grade for it. I guess my question is, because so many people are doing really well, is it too easy? And that's where I have different feelings about different things, you know. So in some ways I think it's good. I just don't want people to think that this is, you know, a really easy class. I think you guys have had to do plenty of work throughout the semester. So if you can give me feedback on those two things, that'd be great. The last data collection and the final. As always, if you have any questions, email me, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this class. It's really weird because I've had very little interaction with you, but it's been a good class. So, all right, have a good summer. Bye.